Now we're going to learn how to prepare knit material for sewing. We're going to go over how to press your knit material flat, how to cut knit material using paper patterns, and how to sew knit material using a regular home sewing machine. So this material that we'll be using today, this is gray cotton jersey knit. This material, you'll probably be familiar with it. Most people are. Cotton jersey knit is commonly found in t-shirts, on underwear, in leggings. It's everywhere, and it's a wonderful fabric. The best thing about knit material is that it stretches. So, the first thing you want to do with your knit material is you want to press your material flat. That makes your knit material easy to work with. So to press your knit material flat, what you want to do is you want to turn your iron on. Hopefully you have an iron that has steam. You're really going to need some steam in this process. And go to your ironing board. Lay your knit material out flat, especially here on the edges. You'll notice that when you cut into knit material, it tends to curl. When you press your knit material flat before you start to sew, you are minimizing that curl effect and making it much easier for you to cut your pattern to sew your cloth. So, lay your knit material flat on your ironing board and use a piece of 100% cotton material. In this case, I'm using muslin. This is a very common fabric. Just get a small piece of muslin. You're going to cover up your knit material. Make sure everything is flat. And then you're going to take the iron, which has the steam turned on, and you're going to steam your knit material flat. One thing that you'll notice as I am steaming this knit material is I'm actually picking up my iron and moving it. I'm not gliding it along in an even way. The reason that you do that with knits is knits, of course, tend to stretch, and we don't want to stretch this material before we cut and sew it. Use lots of steam. I'm sure one of the first things you'll notice is that you can see and probably maybe even hear the steam coming out of my iron. Make sure you use a lot of steam. The other thing that pressing and steaming your knit material before cutting, the other big benefit that it gives you is it'll actually help to pre-shrink your cottons. And many people say, oh, you should wash your cotton materials before you use them. And the reason why people say that is cotton responds to heat and water. And that response is to shrink. So you don't have to stick everything in the wash if you don't want to. Using lots and lots of steam and ironing your material flat will actually take some of the stretch out of your 100% cotton materials. And that gives you kind of the same impact as putting your cotton into a hot wash. Alright, and you don't want to stretch your material. What I'm doing is I'm just kind of gently placing the material on the ironing board. And then I'm steaming it again. So just keep steaming, and you want to press. Don't iron. Pressing means applying steam, picking up and moving. So you're going to pick up and move your iron. You're not gliding it or sliding it in any way. Again, use lots of steam in your iron. Here. And when it comes to the water that goes into your iron, I really strongly recommend going to the grocery store and buying a gallon of distilled water to put inside of your steam iron. Depending on where you live, and I live in a very old section of Los Angeles, California, and it just so happens that part of the municipal water system in my area is like the oldest. It's like one of the oldest sections of pipe, like on the West Coast. Like we have hard water as a result. So that means, there's nothing wrong with the water. It just means that there's a lot of minerals in it. Not a big deal if you're just getting a glass of water to like drink or wash your dishes with or take a shower, like it doesn't matter. But when it comes to your iron, some of those deposits like calcium can build up on your iron, and that is going to lead to maybe weird calcium buildup. It looks like white streaks on your iron. Some of that might get on your fabric. So I always use distilled water. Distilled water, they've taken all of those extra minerals out of the water. So it is nothing but H2O, which is great for your iron because when you steam, you get nothing but water vapor as steam and you don't get these extra little things. So quick side note on that. All right, so now we have ironed out our jersey net. So I actually like to do is put this on a roll. And this is my favorite way to roll up small sections of fabric. So I think I went to like a hardware store or something like that to find this. So, but for me, it works out really well. It's just an easy way to keep your fabric flat without, too much craziness. Oops, okay. So my taping skills are questionable today, but here we go. So I'm just using plain masking tape on the end. Doesn't have to be too fancy. Cool. And the cool thing is when you roll up your fabric this way, everything stays flat, which is awesome. Especially when it comes to knits, you really don't want to have like really any wrinkles in it if you can at all avoid that. So for me, my way of avoiding it is rolling things on a kind of oversized tube. And let me turn off my iron. And as you can see, my workspace it's a pretty clear workspace. I really encourage you doing that. One of the things that I see a lot is beginners who get frustrated because they just haven't really established like a clear sewing area. Clean area makes you feel more efficient, makes you do better work. So now that we have our fabric ironed out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it out. On printed jersey knits, you're going to have a right side and a wrong side to the fabric. So I'm going to roll this out. Pretty satisfied with what it looks like. Great. It's nice and flat. Okay. So now with your paper patterns, you're going to take your cutout patterns and you're going to lay them out on your knit fabrics. Now, when it comes to knits, there is a grain line. So this is the selvage, or like the edge of the fabric. Knits, the grain line is gonna go just parallel to that selvage. And you can also see, if you get super up close and look into the weave of the fabric, you can see, you know, which side, you know, what direction the knit and the purl is going, and that's going to be the direction of your grain. So in this particular pattern, we need to cut 2 pieces on a fold. So I'm going to start with this pattern piece right here. Okay. So I've placed it on the fold per the pattern instructions. I'm going to take some pins. Some people like to use pattern weights. Normally they're pretty interchangeable. When it comes to knits, use pins. You don't use lots of them, but use pins to hold your pattern piece in place. Okay, so now this pattern has been pinned to the material. We're excited about that. Now you're going to take your pair of fabric scissors. This pair of scissors is angled, and this is wonderful when you're working with knits. Again, when you work with knits, you don't want to have to pick up the material. Picking it up and playing with it is going to result in messy work when you're done working. So you want to minimize your contact with the fabric as much as possible, and this particular style of scissors just happens to do a really good job at it because of this angle. When I cut, it keeps the cut very, very close to my surface, and that keeps the fabric flat. So I'm going to go ahead and start to cut. So if you notice, as I cut, I'm just using my hand to keep the material and the pattern in place. Alright. So you really don't want to don't pick up your material and the fabric until you're done cutting. If this is your first time cutting into knit material, I will remind you to do one thing. Make the longest cuts that you can make. Super short cuts, you're going to end up with ragged edges on your knits. Okay, and now we're going to cut out this portion. There we go. And we've got our first pattern piece successfully cut out. Now, just for ease of organizing this, I'm going to leave the pattern piece attached. Okay, so now we're going to cut the other side. So again, I'm going to fold my fabric over because this wants you to cut on the fold. Okay, I'm actually going to give myself a little bit more runway to work with. Okay. All right. Pretty happy with the placement. And again, when you're pinning to knit material, use as few pins as you possibly can use. Okay, so now that's pinned on. And another tool that I really enjoy using and recommend using when it comes to knit fabrics, and I use this tool because it's just better, and that is a rotary cutter. So rotary cutters do a phenomenal job on knits for so many reasons. If you choose to use a rotary cutter, make sure that the blade on your rotary cutter is sharp, and if you look around the edge of the blade, you don't want to see any nicks or pits or anything like that. So I'll show you how to cut this out with a rotary cutter. But actually, I just noticed that I pinned off just a little bit. By the way, when you have a pattern piece that says to cut on the fold, it doesn't mean cut away from the fold. It means cut on the fold. That means the edge of this needs to be right on top of the edge of the fold. I shouldn't, I shouldn't see more of this fabric on the other side of the fold. Again, when you're sewing knits, precision is kind of everything, and also knit stretch. So maybe you're just a little bit off. You're off by like a 1/16 of an inch. Okay, well, when you cut something on the fold, it doubles the amount that you're off. So if you're in by a 1/16 of an inch and you cut it, now you're going to be off by an 1/8 of an inch. And if you do that over several pattern pieces, you'll notice after you're done sewing your pattern, it seems that everything ends up a little bit big. That's probably why. Especially with knit materials, like you really want to be as precise as you can. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out with the rotary cutter. Okay, so this is cut. Now, cool. There you go. And with a rotary cutter, again, you get super, super precise cuts. I'm a big fan, clearly. Now, when you're cutting out material, sometimes you're going to end up with scraps, especially long scraps. My preference is to trim these away as I work. I might end up using them in another project. I actually usually save all of my scraps because as I'm sewing, I can actually just use those scraps to test out maybe a different technique, or if I have a really small pattern piece, like this is actually a very small pattern piece. If it's the same material, I'll just go into my stash and see what I've got in terms of scraps. That way, if it's the same fabric, I can reduce the amount of waste generated by my projects. And then again, especially on these really small pieces of the pattern, you really want to be as precise as you can be when you are assembling your pattern pieces. So again, I go ahead and use as few pins as I can when I pin my knit material to the pattern. And a thing about pinning, this is a really small piece. So one thing that you'll notice when I pin is that the edge of the pin doesn't go beyond the pattern piece. That is so that when I'm ready to cut into the material, my scissors don't make contact with the pins. That's a really fast way to dull your scissors, and I don't think anyone wants that. So I'm going to use the rotary cutter on this one as well. There we go. All right. So we are done. We've now successfully prepared our knit material for cutting, cut out the knit material from pattern pieces, and now we are ready to start with the next section, which is going to be assembling our knit garment. Okay, so if you are assembling your knit garment with a regular home sewing machine, this is how you do it. First, once you've cut out all the pattern pieces, I leave the pattern pieces on until I'm ready to use them. So that's what's going on here. So what I have here is a 3-piece boy short. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to attach the gusset to the front part of the boy short. Okay, so a reminder is when you're working with knit material, do your best to not handle the knit material too much. So see, even when I'm pulling out the pins, I'm just trying to keep it as flat on my work surface as I can. And doing that keeps everything nice and flat. So what you're going to do is you're going to pin the right sides to the right sides. So if you have a printed fabric, this is super easy. If your fabric isn't printed, if it's just a plain color, but maybe there's a side of the fabric that you just prefer to use as the right side, that's totally fine. An easy reminder for you is to just, what I do is I actually just take a piece of tape and stick it to the right side of the fabric, or the one that I think is the right side. Especially when you're working with a single color fabric, it can be kind of difficult if it looks the same on both sides. Cool. So now I've laid the front panty to the gusset. Again, keep everything as flat as you can keep it on your work surface. And now I'm going to take some pins and I'm going to pin into my seam allowance. Now, if you're using the boy shorts Chonyville kit, just so you know, the seam allowance is in the pattern itself. So if you're using the Chony kit from Etsy, you don't have to worry about adding or removing extra seam allowance. That's the pattern that's being used for this tutorial. And it's a really great pattern. Okay, so I'm going to put a fair number of pins into this. Make sure it's pinned up nicely. Now, since this pattern only has 3 pieces, once this is pinned up, the front to the gusset, I am also going to pin the back to the other side of the gusset. So let's pull the pins out of the pattern. And again, you're going to align right sides to right sides. So this is the right side. And since it's a single color material, I'm just going to put a piece of blue tape so I know what side is the right side. So So this is the right side on my gusset. I'm gonna flip it, and then I'm gonna align my pattern pieces. So again, the pattern that I'm using for this tutorial is the Choneyville boy shorts. And I'm using the Choneyville boy short kit, which I think is a really great kit to learn from just because it has everything in it. It has like the fold over elastic, it's got the right amount of jersey knit for you to complete your project. And the instructions are really clear. It's awesome. Okay. All right, so if you notice, these two pattern pieces have different shapes. This shape is more of a U shape, whereas the gusset's shape, it's more of a curve. You know, it's more of a concave curve, whereas this one is more convex. One way to make it a little bit easier to pin together is to find the middle, put a pin in the middle, and then just carefully guide the rest of the pattern piece toward the left or the right edge. And again, you don't need to use a lot of pins. You need to use enough pins. And then I'm going to do the same here. And this tutorial, we're going to be using a home sewing machine. So we're not using an overlocker. We're using just a regular, you know, kind of like your starter home sewing machine. Alright, so we're all pinned up. And what you'll notice right away is that my pins are put in perpendicular to our sewing line. That is intentional. Your sewing machine can and will sew over these pins, and you need them there to help guide your project through your sewing machine. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and move over to the machine and continue the tutorial.